Hi, everyone. All right, I think in the interest of time, as we have a lot of content to cover today, we can go ahead and get started. But I just wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar today. Um, my name is Nicole Pavia, and I lead our Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment Program at Clean Air Task Force. And we are so excited to present you all today with the findings from our new report with Acadia Center. The report's called A Smarter Way to Pay Public Financing for Affordable Transmission Development in New England. CATF and Acadia Center are joined here today by our project partners, Peter Shattuck from Power Advisory and Professor Josh Macey from Yale Law School. And they'll both be presenting on their work, so stay tuned for that. To quickly share some information on our organizations before diving into content, CATF is a global nonprofit organization advocating for technology and policy change needed to achieve a zero emissions, high energy planet at an affordable cost. Our infrastructure deployment program at Clean Air Task Force works to identify and overcome barriers to deploying infrastructure that we need to decarbonize and improve grid reliability, resilience, and security. And transmission comprises a significant portion of our portfolio. We focus in the transmission space on siting and permitting of transmission at the federal, regional, and state levels. We also work on social license for the energy transition, including community benefits for transmission lines. And most relevant for today's discussion, of course, we address how to pay for and finance transmission infrastructure. And now I'll pass it over to Jamie Dickerson from Acadia Center to give us an intro on Acadia.
Thanks, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks again to you, Nicole, and the whole Clean Air Task Force team for the great collaboration on this project. My name is Jamie Dickerson. I serve as Senior Director of Climate and Clean Energy Programs here at Acadia Center. If you don't know our organization, Acadia Center is a regional clean energy nonprofit based in Maine and working on research, analysis, and advocacy across the entire Northeast region and beyond. We've long been active on grid advocacy in general, and even transmission financing more specifically. A small number of you may know, in fact, that way back before our name change, we were actually involved in one of the original cases at FERC back in 2012, Environment Northeast versus Bangor Hydro, that led to the recent FERC ruling on transmission ROE in New England. So there's a long history here that predates my time even. As we see on the next slide, we have also continued to work on a number of transmission-related projects in recent years, honestly similar to what Nicole mentioned, but spanning everything from siting and permitting to regional grid planning, interregional coordination under our Northeast Grid Planning Forum project, community benefits and acceptance of transmission lines, and also oversight of spending on local asset condition upgrades. But prior to this project, we hadn't really looked more closely at transmission financing alternatives. So that's one of the big reasons why we were so excited to partner with the task force team to see what type of savings we could unearth for ratepayers in this region. As we see on the next slide, I think that the affordability lens is perhaps no surprise what makes this report incredibly timely right now. The fact of the matter is transmission costs have been rising in New England. They're now some of the highest transmission rates in the nation, about 20 to 30% of wholesale energy costs in the region in the last 1 to 2 years. And that increase has been one contributor to the broader energy affordability crunch that has gripped the region for the same period of time. At the same time, we know that appropriate transmission investments are going to be critical to meeting the region's future goals. But, they have to be funded in a manner that provides adequate and not excessive profits, and really, measured and benchmarked against the relatively low risk in this field. So looking ahead, we know that even more major additional transmission grid upgrades will be needed for reasons of asset age and condition, for growing electricity demand, and integrating clean energy. And those costs will be substantial. ISO New England's 2050 transmission study projected a range of between $16 to $26 billion of transmission investment needed by 2050. And the major category of investment in recent years, those local asset rebuilds, those are also expected to continue in the future with, I think, more than $5 billion in new asset condition projects under construction or planned to address aging infrastructure in the next, I believe, 8 years alone. So at the same time, there are new needs, new opportunities emerging as well, beneficial linkages between New England and its neighboring grids, new resource opportunities for clean energy like Atlantic Canadian offshore wind, all of which is very promising. And the good news is that the six New England states have been collaborating exceptionally well in the last handful of years on transmission, most notably through the LTTP, the Longer Term Transmission Planning Agreement, the broader Northeast States Collaborative on interregional transmission, the Northern Maine RFP, some of the cross-border work with Canada through the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers, and beyond. And just to make things even more interesting, this report, as many of you know, is coming out right in the middle of new debates, I guess I'd say reignited, about the appropriate level of investment return for transmission projects in the region, referred to as ROE, as you see on the bottom bullet there, with this recent FERC ruling proposing to bring down the financing costs borne by ratepayers in a somewhat similar direction as the public financing tools that we are examining in this report. So that's a little bit of the backdrop and the policy context. I'll turn it back to Nicole for a little bit of background on this report.
Thank you so much, Jamie. So like Jamie said, we wanted to do this project jointly to address the increasing cost of transmission development in New England, address the need for transmission development in New England as well, and examine how public financing, public-private partnerships, and other innovative arrangements could work economically, institutionally, and legally in the region. And just a little bit of background on how we kind of came to this project. CATF and Net Zero California, a nonprofit organization in California, we conducted a similar public financing analysis in that state, examining public financing mechanisms and opportunities there. And since that report was released, California passed legislation instituting what they're calling a transmission infrastructure accelerator, whose job is to coordinate and plan for public-private partnerships and financing of transmission infrastructure. So this is building on, some other work happening across the country right now. Like Jamie said, this report really feels very timely in its release. And our key motivation was this affordability challenge and crisis that is very apparent and politically salient at the moment, of course. We also wanted to address the need to get socially beneficial projects built to help achieve state and regional goals while balancing the cost of those investments. And like Jamie said it exactly, we know that the New England states have partnered before on major transmission initiatives. So we wanted to make sure that anything we proposed in this report was additive to that and built upon those existing wins. So not to bury the lead too much, we wanted to pull out some of the top level findings that you'll hear about in much more detail from Peter and Josh and provide them right up front here. So the biggest line items here. The use of public financing mechanisms can reduce new transmission costs by about 43%, which translates to $8.4 billion in savings. It can also reduce the cost of reliability-focused projects, known in the region as asset condition projects, by up to 34% for an additional $1.1 billion in savings over the coming decades. And because of the way that all of these costs factor into ratepayer bills at the end of the day, this can translate to ratepayer savings, which is crucially important for affordability. The mechanisms can be integrated into some of the processes Jamie already mentioned, the LTTP process, the voluntary agreement mechanism, and they also don't require all states to participate. All states can participate, but a single state can consider some of these options on their own. And there are no reforms needed for the ISO New England tariff. Public-private partnerships can also offset public sector exposure to project development risk. And we'll discuss some structures that can support private investment while also leveraging the benefits of public sector involvement. And as for how these mechanisms can be implemented, we'll get into that. But a state or multiple states can create new authorities, or they can expand existing authorities to leverage some of these tools. And both approaches already have precedent in other states. So Josh will talk us through that. Jamie, anything else to add before we dive into content?
Only to observe, Nicole, that across the board we tried to be as sort of reasonable and conservative even as possible with the inputs and assumptions underpinning this analysis. So it's quite possible that these savings opportunities could be substantially larger, meaningfully larger than what we've seen here under the core assessments. There is uncertainty, of course, about how big future peak loads will grow, how much they will grow. How much asset condition projects will be proposed in the future, of course. So I guess I would draw everyone's attention to both the dollar figure savings, but also the magnitude of the percentage savings, which will scale up if there is even more transmission investment needs that are identified, or again, more sort of transmission that this analysis is applied to. For example, the very significant opportunities for interregional projects in the future. So, yeah, why don't we dive in? That's a great setup, though, Nicole. Thank you.
Sounds great. We'll pass it over to Peter.
All right, thank you. I have the pleasure of describing how we identified some of these mechanisms and estimated some of the savings. But first, a quick word about Power Advisory. We're an electric sector consultancy operating in the U.S. and Canada, focus on policy and market analysis, commercial strategy, project development, and my personal favorite, transmission. So, next slide. I think Jamie and Nicole covered this well, but I'll just sum it up that costs are rising just as we need to build more new transmission. Let's move on. So if we want to figure out how to potentially reduce the costs of transmission, first have to understand what's driving the cost now. So under the status quo, the vast majority of projects in New England are built by private investor-owned utilities, and the cost of these projects is compensated through cost of service rates that are regulated by FERC, and those rates are composed of four elements. A return, which itself is two elements. The return on equity that's put forward, you could think of this as equivalent to the down payment on a house, and then the cost of debt used for the balance of the project cost not covered by equity. The cost of depreciation, so a deterioration of the asset over its life, operations and maintenance, and income taxes and other local taxes, just property taxes. We have an illustrative distribution of costs that would comprise the revenue requirement. The revenue requirement is essentially you could think of as the cost of the transmission over its lifetime, and these are based on some components from formula rates in New England. So 42% debt, 58% equity, so fairly significant down payment. To continue with that analogy, we used the 11.07 returns at the time that the analysis was conducted, but as Jamie noted, those are in play right now. Cost of debt from formula rates and then a number of other kind of standard assumptions here. So next slide. So there are basically two ways to reduce the cost of transmission, either reduce the cost of financing or reduce the cost of transmission itself, or they can be combined. So we looked at four main levers here. The first is to swap out private debt, building on the strong credit rating, and so typically lower borrowing costs that public entities have. The second would be increasing leverage, so substituting lower cost debt for higher cost equity. And then joint public-private ownership, where a public financing entity, beyond just providing debt, would step in and take a minority stake in a project to develop alongside a public entity. If the public financing entity is seeking lower returns, that would reduce the aggregate return on equity, and there would also be benefits in that public financing entities would not be subject to the same taxes as private entities. And then the additional piece, and this builds on what the New England states are doing now, would be to continue utilizing competitive procurement, so ensuring that all projects are put out to bid and the best options can be elicited from the market. There are a multitude of other public-private partnerships and structures that could be utilized. In this, we settled on the joint public-private ownership, largely based on the feedback that we had from stakeholders, which I'll get to. And then it's important to note that there are multiple other ways to reduce transmission costs by improving approval processes, expediting permitting, a number of things that are underway, but those also are beyond the scope of this analysis. Next slide. So as noted, we wanted to ensure that this analysis was grounded in what's most relevant to policymakers and stakeholders in the region. So we had a number of interviews with regional policymakers, lenders, entities that are doing public financing in other jurisdictions, and transmission developers and other stakeholders. So one thing we heard loud and clear is If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you can improve it, try to use the existing mechanisms that the states have spent a lot of time developing, the LTTP and the aforementioned voluntary agreement. A desire for flexibility so that a subset of states could step forward and provide public financing, but not require all states, nor require the approval of all states to utilize that mechanism. Importantly, there are risks associated with the public stepping back into kind of electric infrastructure development, such as delays and cost overruns that sometimes hit transmission projects. But it's worth noting that under the status quo, the cost of those risks are passed on to ratepayers ultimately through formula rates. So it's not an issue about a new risk, it's an issue about who's trying to manage that risk and who's best suited to manage it. Importantly, additionally, the funding approach of using revenue bonds that would be backed by FERC-approved rates creates a pretty stable and predictable revenue stream. So that itself is fairly low risk for repayment. And also the project revenue bonds would not encumber the broader ability of states or public entities to issue general revenue bonds to support other objectives. We talked to municipal utilities and learned about their ability to already, under existing authorities, provide public financing at rates that are typically attractive in comparison to investor-owned utilities. And then from transmission developers, an important consideration about how public participation, particularly very early in the project, could create inefficiencies and slow things down. So you only have to imagine what it would take for a public entity to sign off on getting real estate agreements or major equipment purchases to see how this could happen. So took all these into account. Next slide. So with all that in mind, we came up with 4 scenarios that would be evaluated in comparison to the status quo. Each of these would use project revenue bonds, and the first 3 here would build on the competitive solicitation process that's currently in place. And we order these here basically from least risk to most risk to the public. And that really amounts to at what stage in the project development life cycle would public financing be utilized. So starting at the top, the latest stage where public financing could come in would be for takeout financing. So projects are procured, they're developed, built, brought into service, and then once they're operating, public financing entity would provide takeout financing, which you could think of really as kind of refinancing. Once it's lower risk, then you'd have the public financing come in. So here the public is very exposed only to the risk that something happens after the project comes in service. The next one would be to have public financing, public debt come in at final investment decision. So this is when a developer has all of their permits and approvals in hand and they're ready to start construction. So then public entity would come in and they would provide the debt to cover construction and the takeout financing. So they would be taking on some of the risk during the construction period. The next would be to come in alongside the developer even earlier in the process. So if the LTTP or voluntary agreement are used, when a project is selected, that is when public entity would take a minority stake in the project and then would fund the continuing development with equity and then would provide the debt for construction and takeout financing. And then the last option would be a wholly public, where essentially this is not a competitive process, but where a public entity comes in and finances, develops, builds, owns, and operates the project for its entire life cycle. This would be the most significant use of low-cost financing, but it would forego that opportunity to have projects competitively selected. Next slide. There are 3 variants that could be incorporated into these mechanisms. The first one would be to have public power, so municipal utilities or co-ops come in alongside public entities, and this would enable utilization of their competitive financing options and also allow public entities to participate. It's an appreciable share of customers and load in New England, so enabling them to participate in the transmission build out. And so this could both reduce costs and build on the experience that public power has in building projects. And so the way this could be incorporated is in the public debt and equity-backed scenario. Munis and co-ops could come in alongside a public financing entity or in lieu of a public financing entity. Another option would be to raise additional funds on the back of public financing to support community benefits, or could be ratepayer refunds. This would potentially increase support for the project, both in communities affected by the project and more broadly if there's funding provided. And that would be raised, as I'll talk about a bit more, on the back of public financing. And then a last scenario, and we heard this from other jurisdictions, is a way to maintain some private sector perspective on the lending side. So here you would have private lenders, banks essentially come in alongside the public financing entity to have a seat at the table and ensure governance and good project management that could reduce the risks of cost overruns and construction delays. And that would be by giving a minority stake in a minority share of the construction financing to a private entity. Next slide. So how would this work? In practice, what this would amount to is in utilizing the existing competitive mechanisms, public financing entity, and Josh will talk more about what that would be or how that would be set up, would make an offer to all bidders at the front end of a solicitation for public financing. And that would mean that at the time of the solicitation issuance or beforehand, states would put an offer on the table, or the public financing entity would put an offer on the table. If it's just debt, that would be the amount of debt, the interest rate, and other terms. If it's debt and equity, additional terms related to the equity. And importantly, a stipulation about a preferred capital structure. So saying what sort of distribution do we want to see between debt and equity? And that provides a meaningful opportunity to swap out high cost equity with lower cost debt. And entirely voluntarily, bidders could enter into a discussion with the public financing entity and come back with terms that they would need, which might include a kind of higher return on equity if they're giving up some of the project share. States, if they accept that offer, if they see that it has benefit, would then agree to the commercial terms. And if the bidder incorporating public financing entity is selected, then those terms go into effect for the project from that point forward. Next slide. So a couple benefits here. From a practical standpoint, as noted, this would not require modifying the longer-term mechanism or getting into ISO New England tariff reforms. This would be entirely separate from the conduct of the procurement and would only affect the financing. The voluntary agreement mechanism is much broader, so it would not require reforms either. And then if an agreement is reached for public financing, that only applies to the public financing entity or the state behind it and the bidder. Does not encumber any non-participating state. On the economic side, there are a few benefits. First, states don't have to accept, or public financing entities, I'm using that term interchangeably, don't have to accept any sort of counteroffer that would degrade savings. And then if they stepped away, the process would go as it does now. But there would be competitive pressure for bidders to accept and propose reasonable returns, reasonable terms for incorporating public financing into their bids. And that's because of competitive pressures. If a bidder did not accept public financing but the competitor does, when projects are stacked up against each other, if the project that accepts public financing is favorable on economic terms, it's going to have a better chance of winning. So you're utilizing the power of competition to come to a reasonable outcome here. Next slide. So talking about how we set up the model, we looked at both new transmission and asset condition projects, slightly different assumptions for each in comparison to the status quo. So for new transmission, we used the low-end cost estimate from the ISO New England transmission study, lower load and lower transmission costs. We assume that competition creates a 15% reduction in the capital cost of the project, and this is due to competitive pressure and possible creative project designs and based on some prior analysis. And then we look at, rather than settling on a single value for financial terms, we look at a range of possible scenarios that I'll talk about in the following slides. But importantly, we assume that a good share of these new transmission projects are greenfield, meaning that they're not going through existing rights of way. They may need to go through new areas. For asset condition projects, we use the total as of October of last year for the planned and proposed projects. We didn't assume competition. We assumed the utilities continue to build, own, and operate these asset condition projects. We also assumed a range of commercial terms, but we assumed that majority of these are rebuilds, therefore lower risk, and then we assume a 1% reduction in the returns that would be required due to that lower risk profile. Next slide. So a key consideration that we had spent some time wrapping our heads around is, what would the impact be? And how would public participation in these projects be viewed? This hasn't been done before. The public sector largely stepped back from investing in these types of projects some time ago. So could be viewed either positively or negatively. On the one hand, public entities' ability to facilitate approvals, to increase public support for a project, could be perceived to lower risk. On the other hand, increased political exposure or impaired flexibility could be seen to increase risk for the projects. And that would translate into the commercial terms that both lenders and investors, so think of the private banks or developers, would need to see on the project. So if lower risk is perceived, then there could be more debt and less equity. Converse, if higher risk is seen to come out of this approach. And then similarly, from a bidder standpoint, if they think that this is going to increase their chances of getting the project built and lower risk, then a bidder might seek lower returns, whereas if it's seen to increase the risk profile, a bidder might need to see higher returns. So I'll walk through an example on the next slide of how this worked out in the assessment. So as noted, we didn't want to settle on a single number because this will ultimately be up for the market to determine what sort of financial structures would be acceptable. But we looked at a range of how risk could flow into leverage in the capital structure and returns that are requested by bidders. So going across the top of this chart here, this table, we look at the public debt at commercial operation and delivery. So this is coming in at the back end of the project. Similar dynamics for each of the scenarios evaluated. If the public financing is perceived to reduce risk, then you could have higher leverage. So in this case, we think you'd go 75% debt, 25% equity. If it's seen to increase risk, then you have a lower share of debt and a higher share of equity. Similar dynamic when it comes to what returns would be commanded or required by bidders to accept public financing. If they think public financing entity coming in is going to help them get their project built or selected, then they may reflect that in a lower required return of 10% in this case, or at the high end 13%. So these are illustrative. But what they result in is ultimately the weighted average cost of capital. So this is what could be thought of as kind of the cost of financing for these projects. So I won't walk through each of these scenarios. This is essentially what would come out of a negotiation, but you could think about this sort of assessment as what would happen in a negotiation between a public financing entity and a bidder. Public financing entity would put forward their proposed terms, bidder would counter with a return on equity, and then the numbers are crunched and you see how that weighted average cost of capital compares to the status quo, which we've noted down here is quite a bit higher than these scenarios we have here. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. Talk about how what we saw out of these results. So to walk you through this chart here, what we're showing is the annual average revenue requirement, i.e., cost for these projects, under these different public financing scenarios, and stacked up by the cost component. So return on the rate base, basically the return on the transmission, depreciation, operating expenses, and taxes nestled down there in the corner is the green. And then we have the best case are the solid bars. So that would be if public financing is perceived to reduce risk. And then the worst case are those dashed bars on top if it's seen to increase risk. So next slide. So that's what ultimately arrived at those headline figures that Jamie and Nicole went over at the beginning. In the best case scenario, under the public debt and equity backed, so public coming in early in the process and seeing the reduced risk, you could get on the order of 43% savings. And then at the low end, coming in later in the project and being perceived to increase risk would still provide savings on the order of 19%. Next slide. It's a similar story for asset condition. The main difference here is that we don't assume competition. So the savings are slightly larger. But on the next slide, you see that they're still appreciable. So same scenarios provide the kind of highest and lowest savings on the order of 8% to 34%. So moving on to some of the discussion, and then I'll wrap up. So what we saw in this setup is their mechanisms and their potentially significant savings. But this is really going to depend on the magnitude of the savings is going to depend on how these negotiations, how the market would perceive and react to this participation of public financing entities. You could incorporate these into the existing transmission procurement mechanisms to maintain the benefit of competition. And then ultimately, it's an option. It's an option both for developers and for states. If the states can get a deal that will ensure savings, then you go for it. If bidders come back and say, nope, this is too risky, then you continue as it is under the status quo. The flexibility is incorporated such that one or more New England states could offer public financing, but not all of them would have to. And then, importantly, if this is a mechanism that helps reduce costs, it could also create more opportunities for bidders by reducing the total cost and enabling more projects to be put out to the market. And lastly, on this slide, applying this mechanism to asset condition projects may require legislation. So, final couple pieces, talking a bit more about public benefits funding. So, this is a concept that came out of the discussions and some of the work that CATF has done before of looking at commercial models where revenue is raised for affected communities. And this could be done in one of two ways. One, it could be on the back of equity participation. So if the states say, rather than requiring equity returns that are just covering our debt, we want to have a little bit more, and we'll use that surplus revenue to fund community benefits. A 1% ROE increase could raise on the order of $100 to $300 million, or it could be done on the backs of debt. So if public financing entity lends to developers at a slightly higher cost than their borrowing costs, that would also raise significant funding. There are trade-offs involved here because either of those mechanisms would increase costs to ratepayers, so it's really a public policy decision. How much is that worth it, and what are the trade-offs there? As noted, there are public risks, but those risks right now are still carried by ratepayers at the end of the day. So it's an issue of who manages those best and how can they be minimized. So with that all said, let me pass it over to Josh.
All right. Hello, everybody. I won't do an introduction. I'm just going to jump through my slides because there are a lot of good questions in the Q&A. So for reasons Peter mentioned, we spend a lot of money on transmission, and opportunities for public financing could bring costs down potentially significantly. Next slide, please. So my goal in the next 15 minutes is to explain what specifically needs to be done from a legal and governance perspective in order to authorize New England states to do and engage in public financing for transmission. Um, there are basically four legal things New England states have to do, some of which are already done. The first is there needs to be an entity with legal authority to issue debt to support transmission. The second is that that needs to include the authority to issue bonds, preferably revenue or mortgage bonds, such that the risk associated with the project is limited and cannot spread and implicate the full faith and credit of the state. The third, and I think this might come up in Q&A, is the entity has to have some means of participating in the relevant processes for selecting and then assigning and recovering the costs of transmission. So there are a few ways to do this, but at a high level, you can build large transmission projects in New England either by participating in the ISO New England process or through a state voluntary approach. And to participate in the ISO New England process, some entity must be a participating transmission owner. This gets wonky, but what it basically means is you need to have signed a contract between ISO New England and transmission owners that was signed in 1997. So there are a few ways that this can work. The first and most straightforward is for a public-private partnership. So in other words, if the financing authority partners with one of the existing participating transmission owners, that entity has authority under ISO New England tariffs to recover its costs, and that would be the means of cost recovery. So one of the questions in the Q&A asked, who pays the debt service? It would be under this approach, ratepayers, and the revenue would be allocated through the ISO New England tariff, and it would be the participating transmission owner. The other option is to create a new entity. So MWEC, for example, the Massachusetts Municipal Wholesale Electric Corporation or company, is already a participating transmission owner, but the other potential entities are not. So they either have to become a participating transmission owner or partner with an entity that is. The fourth thing that is important is you need governance and risk mitigation mechanisms to make sure that the entity is responsive to state interests and that risk cannot spread beyond those associated from the project to other budget priorities. The last two things I'm going to talk about, which my impression from talking to some folks is a concern or a point that is on folks' mind is how do you, in a multi-state region, make sure that cost allocation does not result in, say, Massachusetts or Maine or Connecticut or Rhode Island or whichever state subsidizing other states? That's the first issue. And what I'll hopefully convince you of is there's no chance that will occur. And the second point is, are there jurisdictional issues? In other words, I don't know if there are many lawyers on this, but many of you probably know that FERC regulates transmission rates. So there may be concern that the state would be preempted here. That too is not a concern for reasons we'll get into. So next slide, please. This Peter covered. It was just my slide saying, hey, you can bring costs down. So let's go to the next slide in the interest of time. So I'll be very brief here, but it's important to emphasize that where our proposal comes in the process for planning, selecting, and then allocating the costs of transmission. The way that we designed this is that this is purely a cost minimization tool. The states that you could build this or tack this on to more ambitious approaches to reform transmission planning, but this comes in at the financing stage. So either ISO New England or states in separate processes will identify the need. There will be a solution that is selected about which project, and this is just a way to bring costs down. Similarly, cost allocation will also operate either through the ISO New England tariff or through a separate voluntary approach. But this is just a way of arguably increasing the debt to equity ratio and then ensuring that the debt is cheaper. All right, next slide, please. So these are the four, in designing this, states would have two options. The first is to tweak or take advantage of existing financing authorities, and the second is to build a new one altogether. Either way, whatever entity would be used needs to follow these four basic principles. The first is clear statutory authority. The second is financing powers that limit risk exposure. So presumably it should be a revenue bond. The debt would be serviced on the basis of revenue collected from the project in which the costs are allocated to ratepayers. And there would be no ability to pursue to collect revenue from other sources. So the state would not be exposed to the possibility of cost overruns. The entity needs to be compatible with the ISO New England tariff. In other words, it either needs to be a participating transmission owner or have authority to contract with a participating transmission owner. And finally, there must be governance and risk controls, such as debt caps, risk sharing, transparency, and ongoing oversight to make sure that the financing authority is pursuing interests that align with the states. Next slide, please. This, again, I'll be very brief. To the extent that New England wants to use transmission to pursue other priorities, that could be included in covenants in the debt. So you could have labor and workforce participation. There could be community engagement requirements, environmental stewardship. And one extremely important provision is that there should be ongoing monitoring and cost discipline. One thing I will say about this is these debt covenants such as these could be useful both because they would allow states to pursue policy priorities, but also because some of these issues, especially community engagement and labor and workforce participation, are often obstacles to transmission. And so some other states that have done this, particularly Colorado and New Mexico, have used community engagement and coupled it with siting authority. So some of the common roadblocks to transmission are dealt with in part through the financing vehicle. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are three. There are other financing authorities, but there are a variety of existing entities that already have authority to support energy infrastructure in New England states. And here are three illustrative examples. Arguably, the most powerful is MWEC. This is a municipal wholesale electric company in Massachusetts that represents municipal light districts. One of the advantages of MWEC is that it has very, very powerful existing statutory tools such that there would be no legislative reform required to use MWEC to finance transmission. The primary drawback is that MWEC has typically understood its obligation to be to the municipal light districts, all of which have powerful governance tools. They are represented on the board. So there would be some amount of cultural change. MWEC may be eager to do this, or it may be concerned about expanding its mandate to pursue a broader set of goals that don't seem to be those of the municipal light districts it represents. In my opinion, the use of revenue or mortgage bonds could be used to reassure that the municipal light districts would not be exposed to any risk, but that's a complicated political issue. Mass Development is another entity within Massachusetts that already has powerful financing tools. It's a statewide financing agency with a strong bond toolkit. The primary drawback is that its projects are typically structured to support discrete local benefits, and there would arguably need to be some statutory amendment to make sure that it supports large-scale transmission. The Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank operates similarly to Mass Development. All right, next slide, please. So, just to recap, the benefit of using an existing financing entity is that they already exist. The primary drawbacks is that they may not have governance or a statutory mandate or expertise designed to pursue transmission. And so those are the basic two approaches. Oh, next slide, please. 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 We're gonna race through this. Okay, so there are just two other things I want to go through, but I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So there are basically four authorities outside of New England that have already supported quite a significant amount of transmission investment. Probably the most powerful one is New Mexico's Renewable Energy Transmission Authority, RETA. This is a purpose-built authority that can plan and finance high voltage transmission. Like the entities we're proposing, it primarily partners with private developers. So RETA has already partnered with more than 1,000 miles of high voltage transmission. This includes a partnership with Pattern Energy for an $11 billion transmission project that is currently operational. As Peter mentioned, it issues tax-exempt, non-recourse revenue bonds. Note that it has very, very strict governance requirements. The board is appointed by the governor and/or the legislature. Some board members are appointed by the governor, others by a legislature. There are various statutory requirements that board members possess expertise, and it is primarily supposed to enter into public-private developments to bring renewables from New Mexico to markets. The Colorado Electric Transmission Authority is modeled off of New Mexico's RETA. It's very, very similar. Two things you should note. In some senses, it has broader authority, and in some senses, it's narrower than RETA. The Colorado Authority participates in corridor identification, so it sort of sneaks into planning in a way that may or may not be outside the bounds of what we're discussing. The other thing is, though, it's primarily a backstop authority. So it operates primarily when existing private developers are unable or unwilling to enter into to develop transmission projects. Next slide, please. The other two examples are the New York Power Authority and then California in SB 254 recently created the Transmission Infrastructure Accelerator, which is a part of California's governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, which can develop and finance major electric transmission infrastructure. These authorities, so the New York Power Authority is a public power authority that, like MWEC, can itself build transmission. It is often the owner of transmission. And it has existed for decades and is primary, and it also identifies corridors. The California example, I just want to spend a second on because it is, I think, quite relevant here in that California, like the New England states, is in a restructured market. And so many of the projects the infrastructure bank is expected to fund would come out of CAISO's transmission plan, and it would be an option for bringing down costs. And I'll come back to that when we get in a second. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there are the first question. I'm going to just, I know we're running low on time, spend my remaining minutes on two possible concerns. One is in a multi-state RTO, if a Massachusetts entity funds a multi-state project, would this result in cross-subsidization? And the answer is no. If you really want to dig into this, I urge you to read a paper I published called The Law and Economics of Transmission Planning and Cost Allocation. But assuming you don't want to do this, the way that we allocate large-scale transmission projects today is we identify if the state provides benefits to multiple regions. So if a state reduces the cost of energy and improves reliability in both Connecticut and Massachusetts, we say the line produces, say, $100 in benefits, $25 in economic benefits, $25 in reliability benefits in both states. Each state gets 50% of the benefits. Each state is assigned half of the costs. So even if a Massachusetts entity fully funds the project, it would recover costs under the ISO New England tariff from both states. And because this operates under what we call the beneficiary pays approach, there would be no concern that Massachusetts customers would be paying for benefits to Connecticut, because ISO New England would estimate that half of the benefits accrued in Connecticut ratepayers, those ratepayers would be assigned those costs. This would not disrupt any of the cost allocation procedures. If states wanted to have multiple agencies participate, that would be fine, but there would be no need. And note that MWEC has financed some transmission, but also, for example, it has helped finance nuclear reactors in New England, and this is the cost allocation procedure it is used. So there's no kind of new cost allocation thing that would operate either within the ISO New England tariff or from the perspective of the existing authorities. All right, next slide, please. So the last question is, would any of this be preempted? And the answer is absolutely not. So the most straightforward way that this could occur is that there's a competitive solicitation, and a bidder that wants to avail itself of a tool for reducing its financing costs would be more competitive. The New England state would not be setting the rate for transmission. It would be providing financing that would allow some developer to submit a lower bid. That has been done in other states. There's no question that there are no FERC issues. So to the extent this is a voluntary way, there's just simply no problem from a preemption standpoint. The question you may encounter is, well, what if a New England state wants to mandate this? You may think, hey, that is setting the transmission rate, but that's incorrect for somewhat technical reasons. The first is that a provision of the Federal Power Act that people don't always talk about, but Section 204 of the Federal Power Act gives states authority to regulate the capital structure of FERC wholesale rates, meaning under the Federal Power Act itself, even when FERC, under the formula rate process, says this is your returns, states, if they want to, can say, we will regulate the capital structure, and this would fairly uncontroversially be an example of that. The second reason is that states, when FERC regulates formula rates, it sets the return based on the utility's costs, but it doesn't say these are the costs you should incur. So what a state would be doing if it directs a utility to take advantage of lower cost options is it would be regulating the inputs of formula rates, but what FERC regulates is the output, which is the authorized return. And so again, FERC simply has to accept the costs that the utilities have, and this would be very similar. This is exactly what California and New Mexico and Colorado and New York have already done. So I know that was quick, but I want to leave time for questions. And I'm also happy to answer any of the technical questions on or offline.
Thank you so much, Josh and Peter. Clearly, we're the beneficiaries of a great brain trust on this project, so it's so great to have had your expertise brought to bear. So with our remaining time, let's jump into Q&A. I will note Peter and others have been doing a great job of answering questions in written form, but just to go over a couple of them that remain, I do think, Peter, we should have you speak about comparisons between the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, between the different scenarios and the existing existing status quo, and maybe you could also touch on what we refer to as pre-tax WACC, which it basically factors in the corporate tax rates that investor-owned utility financing is obligated to pay.
Yeah, so at a simple level, you've got, call it 10% ROE that utilities are looking for now, or in New England, following the FERC ruling. And you compare that to the borrowing costs for public entities. And what I put in the chat is what we have in the study there, and you can see the detail in the link, and that even has the links back to the sources themselves, but was a basket of public financing. I don't think it's in here, Nicole. It's in the assumptions document, or assumptions of the online version of the report. But we looked at what the rates were on recent bond issuances for municipal bonds, and it was in the range of, call it 4.5%. So there in itself is a pretty significant shift or difference between returns, because essentially that would be the floor for public financing entities' returns. They would need to cover their debt service, but they don't have the profit motive that a private entity would have. So it would be somewhere between either set at that low 4.5% or potentially higher if there's the desire to raise additional revenue for other purposes. The cost of debt is closer. There's not as much of a spread here, but at worst, it's kind of on par with what the utilities have. So that translates into, what these calculations we put in for WACC. We were reticent to settle on a single number here. So it would really depend on kind of what the bundle of capital structure and returns would be for the participants. But important comparison point here that Jamie indicates is, these scenarios that we've laid out all result in a weighted average cost of capital that's less than, even at the high end, 7.11% than what we have under the status quo. And when you further account for the avoidance of tax, the spread is even greater. So it could be the difference up to 10.12% when you're basically having to pay for the tax costs for private entities.
Great. Thank you, Peter. A couple of unanswered questions that remain. One, have there been any clear signals of support for this approach amongst the state governments in the region? And then a related question, would creation of a new financing authority require legislative action in each of the 6 New England states? On that latter one, actually, the answer is no. Certainly, if a new financing authority were to pass in 6 states, that would be great. But we believe that at a minimum, only one state would need to act to either authorize an existing financing authority or to create a new financing authority. If the question is about if New England wanted to create a New England-wide new financing authority, I guess there probably would need to be some authorizations made, again, either within existing pathways or new authorities, just to stand that type of sort of a new power authority up, if that was what the question is getting at. And on the level of support amongst the states, obviously we're only a week removed since the release of the report, but we have had some very positive discussions, including in the sort of outreach and engagement phase of this project with states across the region. So we're looking forward to engaging with policymakers now in sort of the next phase of this report, both to educate and sort of socialize the learnings from the analysis, but also to talk about, what implementation could look like in the near future. I believe there's one question that we haven't answered yet about the views of the panel on securitization. So at the risk of jamming that into the final minute here, does anyone want to share a quick word about securitization as distinct but related to what we're talking about here?
I don't want to. I think that Halsey Snow's question is really important. One of the benefits of a financing authority rather than a planning authority is it allows a state to provide a take it or leave it offer that brings financing costs down without collaborating with other states. So when you get into things like the voluntary state agreement approach, that involves coordination, but this is a way to bring costs down, even if a state asks unilaterally and without exposing itself to any risk. Beyond that, with the transmission project not working out. On securitization, I think that's a very important question. It's so in some ways beyond the scope of this. There are tricky balance sheet questions about whether you can use public financing. I think there are ways to do it, but I'm not gonna. If anonymous attendee wants to talk about that, I'd be delighted to. It involves a kind of separate legal questions and how do you avoid certain takings arguments, because you're taking it off of the entity's balance sheet rather than making it a forward-looking voluntary thing the utility can opt into.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that final note. I think at this point we will wrap up. But I just want to, on behalf of CATF and Acadia Center, thank you so much for joining, and thank our panelists here as well, Peter and Josh. our project partners for their continued support and very hard work on this project, which is evident, I think, from what you've seen today. So with that, have a great rest of your week, and thank you so much for joining. You know where to reach us if you have any questions or want to discuss any further findings from the report. But thank you so much for your time.